relations between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean. So this panel is organized by EU LAC Foundation, the Regionalism Observatory, the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, in the European Studies section of the University of Coimbra. And I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this event together. In the previous panels, we talked about topics such as trade and sustainability, environment and climate change. And today, this panel discusses how current global challenges have impacted human rights and multiculturalism, considering how COVID-19 crisis, it also presents itself as a humanitarian crisis. It has been intensifying the displacement of people in countries such as Venezuela, increasing gender-based violence, and reinforcing domestic political tensions and social unrest, as we can see in countries such as Colombia and Bolivia here in Latin America. In Brazil, human rights and multiculturalism have been constantly challenged by Brazilian presidents' authoritarianism, often citing violence and undermining respect for basic human rights. In Europe, we see feelings of social insecurity arise and fuel anti-migration Islamophobic discourse, as well as nationalist and ethnicist rhetoric. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers today, okay? And I'll read the short bio of our first speaker, Patrícia Nabuco Martuscelli. Thank you so much, Patrícia, for being here, for accepting our invitation and for your interest to participate in our panel today. Patrícia has a BA and master's degree in international relations from the University of Brasilia, UNB, and she holds a PhD in political science at the University of São Paulo, USP. She was a visiting fellow at the University of Constance, and between December 2018 and June 2019, she was a visiting scholar at the Jacob Center for Product Youth Department. Now she's currently a lecturer at the University of Sheffield, United Kingdom. She just started her role there, her semester, as she just said, and congratulations on being a lecturer at Sheffield. And her research interests include child migration, children involved in armed conflicts, and migration and asylum policies. Our second speaker is Camila Asano. Hello, welcome, Camila. She has a degree in international relations from the University of São Paulo. In 2009, she completed her master's degree in political science with distinction from the same institution. She's director of programs at Conectas Human Rights. At the organization, she has already coordinated the foreign policy and human rights program and the strengthening the democratic space program. Camila was an advisor to the National Human Rights Council from 2017 to 2020 and was a member of the Municipal Council for Policies for Migrants in the city of São Paulo. She was a professor of international relations at Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado in São Paulo. In 2019, she received the Beth Lobo Award for Human Rights from the São Paulo Legislative Assembly. Our last speaker today is Professor Dr. John Wouters, who is a full professor of international law and international organizations, Jean Monnet ad persona EU and global governance, and founding director of the Institute for International Law and of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. Professor John Wouters is also president of KU Leuven's International Policy Council. He studied law and philosophy at Antwerp University, obtained a master's degree in law at Yale University, and was visiting research at Harvard University. He's adjunct professor at Columbia University and visiting professors at Sciences Po, Université Paris II. He has published widely on international and EU law, international organizations, global governance, and corporate and financial law. So I'd like to thank you again, all the speakers, for your kind willingness and interest to be here in our fourth panel of this series of webinars. And I would like to note that each speaker will have 20 minutes for presentation. And at the end of the presentations, we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. right? But participants can also write their questions in the Zoom, in the YouTube chat, in Spanish or English, because we're having simultaneous interpretation. So the webinar is taking place in Spanish, in English, and you're free to choose whether to present in English or Spanish. And as I said, we'll have the chat on YouTube. So this panel is also being live streaming on YouTube. And another reminder, it's people, you can also watch our previous panels in our channel, Observatório de Regionalismo. So first speaker, Patrícia, Patrícia Nabuco, the floor is yours. And thank you again.
Thank you, Samara. First, I'd like to thank the Observatório for the invitation and the ULAC Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be here with Camila, a person that I admire her work so much, and Professor John, another person that I admire her work. So today I would like to talk a little bit, considering my previous research on family reunification of refugees and migrants in Latin America, the situation of migrant children, and how refugees were affected by COVID-19 in Brazil. So I would like to make reflections about, okay, we have the pandemic, we are living in pandemic times, and how they impact the right to family of those groups that tend to be left behind in their responses to the pandemic. And what are some perspectives, both in Latin America and in Europe, considering the next steps or considering the next phase we are entering now in the pandemic. So I am academic. I have some slides to share, and but I promise I'll be on time. So my presentation today is called "The Right to Family Reunification in Europe and Latin America: Reflections in COVID Times." So I'm going to briefly talk about family reunification for refugees in Europe, some different definitions of family, the difference between asylum and subsidiary protection considering family reunification in the Latin America, and in national countries, the Brazilian policy, and the conclusions considering the challenge that we have due to COVID. So in general, the right to family is recognized in different human rights documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, for example, the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child, regional documents both in the European Union and in Europe, besides the European Union, but also the Council of Europe, but also in Latin America, the Convention of San Jose, El Pacto de San Jose. And so we have a right to family, but it's not clear if there is a right to family reunification. There is when families are separated. If the state has to allow a family member, a relative, to enter and stay in its territory for them to have a right to life. And this is even more complicated when we are talking about refugees or people that are forced displaced, because they cannot go back to their countries of origin or the countries they used to live, because they face a persecution there. So if they come back, their lives can be harmed, they can be tortured. So the only way for them to have family life, to have this right to life, would be having family reunification policies that allow them to be together. So then we have COVID. And COVID, the situation, countries responding to COVID decided to close their borders. And it was an interesting thing because the first time since we have the Schengen agreements and the abolish of internal borders in the European Union, we had European couples and European families being separated in borders. And many pictures, they were in the newspapers of couples kissing through borders that were closed, for example, between Switzerland and Germany, or Belgium and France, for example. And this was the first time that Europeans faced some challenges to be together with people they love as people coming from global south, or people that don't have so powerful passports as global north countries. And then we have the situation that we have movements like love is not tourism, asking for countries to consider couples that are not married as families for them to be together, but we still have a lot of situations of family being separated, including in Europe, especially right now, for example, in the UK with Brexit, and how the European countries they have been responding to Brexit, considering the interests of people living in the UK and the requirements considering testing and quarantine, for example. You still have families being separated, especially families that are not wealthy, do not have so many resources to pay, for example, for quarantine hotels or a lot of tests. So we still have the situation of COVID. So before COVID, the European Union had the Council Directive 2003, 86 on the right to family unification that recognizes specifically that third nationals, they have a right to family unification in the European Union. Problems with the directive. This is a narrow definition of family. So basically married couples and minor children. And even though you have the directive, the countries, they have a lot of freedom to decide the definition of family and the procedures to allow family unification. So most European countries, they ask for DNA tests, they have minimum waiting times. They have, for example, pre-integration tests, like language tests to make sure that the wives and husbands will integrate. They have material exigence, so the family has to have, the person that is applying for family unification has to have house and a minimum salary. And many countries, they adopt the maximum deadlines. And even though the directive explains the need to consider the specific situation of refugees, many refugees, they also have to do all those things to prove that they are family and to bring their families to them. So in general, there is the right to family unification is really hard to access in Europe. There is a denial of family unification, especially for unaccompanied children, because they don't understand the procedures, they are alone. And the situation of COVID made this very complicated scenario even more difficult, with the closure of borders, with the closure of the embassies and consulates who were granting the visas, with delays in all those DNA tests and other pre-integration tests and procedures, and still now with the ban of travel for some countries, especially global south countries. So we see even now that the borders there start to open, family separation inside and outside Europe, especially outside Europe. So COVID has been used as an excuse, as another tool to control migration, especially from global south countries. And according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 85% of all refugees, forcibly displaced populations and refugees, they are in global south countries. So African countries, Asian countries, Latin America. And those are exactly the countries that are continue to face the closure of borders, and those are the families that continue to be separated. Although the European Union has published guidelines explaining the importance to guarantee the right to asylum and the right to family when states were adopting COVID-19 responses, we still see that the right to asylum and the right to family, they were heavily harmed by the COVID-19 responses. So if we see the definitions of families, they vary a lot depending on the countries, according to this study of the European Migration Network. And now we have the different rules considering who is family and how to prove it in the European countries, and also the different rules about who can enter because of COVID, how they can enter, and what are the regulations or documents that are required. And if we consider that, for example, countries like the United Kingdom, they don't recognize the vaccination programs of countries in Latin America, which different Latin American activists have appointed as a discriminatory practice from the British government. We have more rules and more bureaucratic situation and instances that families, they have to navigate, which means separation of family, denial of right to family for refugee and migrant families as well. And another problem that we have is that there are different rules for refugees and people that have other status. So, for example, people that have subsidiary protection and humanitarian protection. Although in the European Court of Human Rights has recently ruled in the case of MA versus Denmark that those differences of rules, they violate the right to life, and they are a clear discrimination between refugees and other populations. Many countries, they still have different rules. And for people that have subsidiary protection or humanitarian protection, they have a hard time to reunite with their families. Other studies also show that women, they have a hard time to be reunited with their family than men, because most of the time they do not meet the criteria, the house criteria and the salary criteria to bring their families, which means further family separation. And COVID has make it even harder. In Latin America, the topic of family reunification appeared in our documents considering asylum topics. So the first time we have the countries recognize the importance of family reunification was in the Declaration of Cartagena in 1984. Then in the Mexico Declaration and Plan of Action of 24, they recognize that the family unit is a fundamental human right of refugees and recommend the adoption of mechanisms to guarantee the family reunification procedures. And recently, in the process of Cartagena Plus 30 with the Brazil Declaration and Plan of Action, they recognize the importance of adopting a different approach of age, gender, and diversity in refugee status determination and in the applications of family reunification. Another development that we have in this discussion of family reunification is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Advisory Opinion 21, considering the rights of migrant children, where the court recognized that the definition of family, when we are thinking about children, goes beyond blood connections. So uncles, aunts, the importance of the extended family, and even people that are not blood related can be family in the context of migrant children. And this expanded definition of family, including extended family members and people that are not family, but that they have this emotional dependence, should be considered in family reunification procedures. So in general, in Latin America, we used to have a more open approach to family reunification. So different countries in the region recognize the right to family reunification and the principle of family unit in their asylum and migration law, including, for example, Brazil. The countries, they tend to have an extended definition of family, not only official marriages and biological children, but other types of family based specifically in economic dependence, not so much in emotional dependence, with the exception of Colombia, who has a definition of nuclear family that's very similar to the European definition. In Brazil, we have this broader definition, including descendants and ascendants and other family members, since there is a situation of economic dependence. And the problem is that we do not have a definition of economic dependence, and there is no consideration of emotional dependence. There is a lack of information on procedures, and there is no appellation mechanisms in Brazil and other Latin American countries when cases of family reunification they are denied. And then we had COVID, and Latin America also closed the borders, which harmed both the right to asylum and the right to family reunification of people. So in Brazil, during my research with refugees, many, they were really worried because they applied to family reunification visas and the consulates, they were closed, their families, they lost their appointments. They were not sure if family members who had already the visa in their passports, if they would be allowed to enter when the Brazilian government closed the borders. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of family separation, especially for Congolese refugees who were already facing family reunification problems in the Brazilian embassy in Kinshasa, due to the understanding of those diplomats about what is being a family, what is being economic dependent, and who are real refugees that should apply to family unification and asylum in Brazil. Besides that, refugees, they were really worried because their families they left behind, they were in countries facing armed conflict, countries facing humanitarian situations like Venezuela, and those countries, they were less equipped to fight COVID-19 than Brazil, for example. So these refugees, they were living the pandemic twice, being worried about the pandemic in Brazil and the people or friends that they were in Brazil, but being really worried about the families left behind and the fact that maybe they could never see this person because this person would end up being killed by COVID-19. So there was a lot of stress and a lot of uncertainty. And the Latin American countries, they also use COVID-19 as a way to close borders. And a lot of family separation that continues to happen in Latin American countries. So what are the challenges that we have in the Brazilian family unification policy for refugees? So we have no clear deadlines. There is a lot of bureaucracy, and especially some organizations like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have a lot of power to decide, and the diplomats abroad, to decide to deny a visa or not. We have a no clear definition of economic dependence. The procedures, they cost a lot of money and time, both in Brazil and Europe. There are a lot of delays. There's a lot of difficulty to access data and information, especially when visas are denied. No clear appeal or revision procedures. The closure of borders due to COVID-19 really caused a lot of problems. And we have no procedures to guarantee the best interest of different children that may be involved in family unification procedures. On the other hand, we have some good practices like the visa facilitation procedure to bring families, is administrative process, so no need to have DNA tests or pre-integration procedures or minimum house requirements like many European countries. Refugees can have the support of civil society and they participate active during the procedure, and we have an extended definition of family if we compare to the nuclear definition of Europe. So what is the way ahead? What can Europe learn from Latin America and what can Latin America learn from Europe? So in general, both regions, they use COVID-19 to close borders. And in both regions, this created separation of families, so both inside region and outside region. And unfortunately, in the future, it's really, really likely that those countries will continue to use COVID-19 and maybe other health risks or threats to closure borders to people in need of international protection. And this will create more family separation. But in any case, Europe could learn from Latin America, the facilitated visas procedures, the expanded definition of family, especially now that we have discussions about care. So who and care responsibilities, and sometimes the parents, they are not the only ones responsible for care of children. Grandparents and aunts and uncles can be really important in this role as well. There is no division between asylum and humanitarian protection, with in theory, all those groups having access to family unification, and no family unification quotas in Latin America. And what can Latin America learn from Europe? Clear procedures and deadlines, the right to appeal and revision, and the guarantee of due procedures, guidelines on the best interest of child and the urgent cases involving, for example, children at risk, and the possibility of funding. Again, it's very likely that COVID-19 and other pandemics will continue to be used to close borders. So in any case, it's really important that we should consider, think about the right family of different people. And especially now that Europeans also had these experiences of family separation during COVID-19, but we still don't know if this will change the perception of European nationals and other nationals about the interest of family, because there is a lot of fear and a lot of discourse surrounding fake marriages or scheme marriages, especially in Europe. Although studies have shown that the number of those fake marriages or scheme marriages really low, and that refugees, and most of those scheme marriages, they happen between Europeans and third nationals, and not between third nationals or between refugees. So yes, thank you so much. Those are some of the reflections I'd like to bring to the debate, considering my expertise. And if you would like to enter in contact with me, here is my email and my Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patrícia. I think it was a very inspiring presentation. And I'm very interested about the idea of the expanded definition of the family in Brazil. It's something quite new for me, and I learned a lot with a presentation, and also the way we can learn with European policies and the Latin American policies as well, for dealing with all this big issue in the COVID-19 crisis. I think this is a very important topic that we're bringing up today, and thank you for presentation. And let's move to our second speaker, Camila Asano from Conectas. Thank you again, Camila, for participating in our webinar series today.
Yeah, thank you, Samara. And I want to thank all the organizers for this web series, and say that for me it's really a pleasure to be here to have these discussions with my colleagues in this panel, but also with the attendees. And I'm coming from this international relation area, so it's always good to be with people discussing international relations. And I was super glad that you invited to talk about human rights and this regionalism and multilateralism perspective, but also how we can find ways of cooperation, international cooperation, even between two different regions like Europe and Latin America and Caribbean. So my name is Camila Asano. I'm the program director of the NGO called Conectas, Derechos, Humanos, Conectas Human Rights. It's a Brazilian NGO. We are based in São Paulo, but we have national and international work. So we do work with different partners in several states in Brazil, in the North region, in the Northeast, in different parts of the country, but also we have an international work. So I believe I'll be touching more some examples of our international work here, but all the time working together with grassroots organizations and local NGOs that are facing the real challenges, right? The NGOs that are dealing with the number of human rights violations that are increasing more and more in the last years. So the Conectas is a Brazilian NGO, and we are combating human rights violations in Brazil using different strategies. So one of the strategies, litigation. So more like strategic litigation in the Supreme Court, using the tools that we have, like the amicus curiae, litigating also in different other jurisdictions in Brazil, defending human rights. We also have a strong work of advocacy at the National Congress, so engaging in the debates around bills that will attack human rights, or some of the bills can be positive and protect human rights. So we have this advocacy work in the Brazilian Parliament. We are also engaging in the public debate, can be social media, can also be in the press, or engaging in mobilizations of campaigns and other ways to engage in the public debate discussing human rights in Brazil. We also use the international mechanisms. So we denounce human rights violations in Brazil at multilateral fora, like the UN Human Rights Council, for instance. So that's why I was really glad that you invited us to discuss, because right now the UN Human Rights Council is under is taking a session in Geneva. So we have a session in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council, and all this debate about new resolutions and how countries from Latin America and Caribbean are engaging with European delegations, something that's part of our daily activities. So it's really interesting to have here the possibility to discuss, right? Even with audience looking at Europe and the European delegations in multilateral spaces. So it would be great to hear Professor Wouters about these contributions of Europe countries in multilateral spaces. Because sometimes, Professor, it's tough to negotiate with them. And migration is one example, as Patrícia was discussing here. So we do this work at Multilateral Forum, taking violations in Brazil, but we also, as Conectas, we are engaging in what we call standard setting process at the UN Human Rights Council, at the Inter-American Commission, or the Inter-American Court, or any other spaces, even in the European Parliament or the European Human Rights Mechanism, because this idea of standard settings and how we can use these regional or multilateral standards to be part of our toolkit, to be using them for the work we do here to defend and protect human rights in Brazil. And this is something that our colleagues in other countries are also doing, using international and regional standards to push for advancements in South Africa, in India, in Indonesia. So these standard settings, these standards that are built in multilateral spaces can and are very useful for us in different human rights agendas. So I just wanted to share a little bit about Conectas. I'm not sure how much the people that are following our discussion here and our debate knows Conectas. So I wanted to introduce a bit the work we do at Conectas, and say that again, it's really a great opportunity to talk about human rights in Brazil, considering that now we are facing one of the most challenging times for human rights in Brazil. And this is because, as Samara said in the beginning, we are living under a constant attack against our democracy. Human rights were never a priority for the current president. Actually, during the campaign, President Bolsonaro, when he was a candidate, he was all the time saying that once president, he would remove a lot of human rights protections. And what we see is his administration even attacking constitutional guarantees and protections. So I organized with help of my colleague Arke as a presentation here, and I will touch 4 topics. One is COVID-19 pandemic and how it's reflecting to the situation in Brazil. Migrant and refugee rights as well. So it's such great opportunity to have Patrícia here to have this kind of exchange. Especially because, as Patrícia said, the pandemic has been used as a perfect excuse for countries to close borders and to remove protections, even from the protections guaranteed by international refugee law or the international human rights law. The third topic is indigenous rights and social environmental rights, because we know this is something that Europe is pretty much concerned about President Bolsonaro's measures here. And it touched a lot the EU and Mercosur trade agreement. That's something that we need to discuss if you want to talk about connections between Europe and Latin America, or at least the Mercosur countries. And I'll finish with civil society space, because it's important for any discussion on democracy and human rights in Brazil to still have a vibrant civil society acting and being free to denounce and to push and hold authorities accountable for human rights violations. And since 2019, when Bolsonaro took office, often we see attacks against human rights organizations, environmental NGOs, activists, human rights defenders. So I couldn't finish here without talking about this. So to be very, and I'm sorry, Samara, I will try to be on time. So if I'm expanding a little bit, please let me know. So about COVID-19, I want to share that Conectas, in partnership with CEPEDISA from the University of São Paulo, we published 10 study bulletins that investigated throughout 2020 more than 3,000 federal norms and more than 4,000 state norms related to COVID-19. And we did it in order to assess its impact on human rights. And the conclusions and the findings of this research, this joint research, is that there was an institutional strategy from the federal government to undermine the efforts to combat the virus. And in the end, the federal administration contributed to spread the coronavirus. So we saw and we mapped during this research attempt, not even attempts, because there was concrete decisions by President Bolsonaro and his cabinet to undermine governors' measures or to veto new laws adopted by the Brazilian Congress that all of them were actually aiming to protect the population. So even one of the examples of a positive response to the situation created by the pandemic is the auxílio emergencial, right? So it's an emergency financial aid provided by the federal government. But even this case wasn't because of President Bolsonaro and his administration. That happened despite of President Bolsonaro and his administration. That was an initiative pushed by civil society, and the Congress and different parliamentarians took the responsibility to foster and approve a law, a legislation giving the grounds for this emergency financial aid. And also the vaccination. So I'm sure all of you were following President Bolsonaro delivering the opening speech at the GA, the General Assembly of the United Nations last week. And he was very proudly talking about vaccination in Brazil. But again, it didn't happen because of his administration. It happened beside all the attempts of his administration to block the purchase of vaccines. We are now facing cases of alleged corruption. So all of this shows how the federal government was really not committed to deal with responsible way to fight the pandemic here. So moving to immigration, it's really important to talk about migration when we have this Latin American Caribbean perspective, especially because I remember once I attended an Inter-American Commission hearing, and one commissioner said to me, "Oh, it's interesting now because we were discussing the Haitian migration to South America." And he said, in the past, we were all the time talking about migration to the north, to Canada, to the United States. But since the 2010, I think we can say that. I don't know if Patrícia agrees with me. We are seeing more and more different routes coming to South American countries, and these routes being consolidating. So we had the Haitians, and then even African flows coming from African countries, also using some of these routes that were established in the Haitian migration, and now with the Venezuela migration flow, it's a new reality for us. And as we discussed before, the pandemic is being used by different countries, and Brazil is not different. So this is an example of Brazil using the Brazilian federal administration. I mean, showing some restrictive measures as part of a sanitarian concern, but in the end, we don't see the sanitarian priority here. One example that we always raise in Conectas is that tourists are welcome. If you come by plane, if you arrive in our airports, you can enter the country since July last year. But refugee families cannot cross border walking in our land borders because they are all closed. So what's the sense of closing the land borders, but opening our air borders like airports? If it's not just a matter of selecting what kind of social and economic profile we want to receive here. And also this, we call here portaria, that's kind of a decree that deals with the rules of the closing borders during the pandemic. And the fact is that borders are closed, and if someone cross the border walking, and this is mostly a reality of vulnerable families, they walk because they cannot afford to come by plane, they have the right to apply for refugee status suspended. So it's something created by the Bolsonaro administration. This is something that cannot be sustained in the Brazilian legislation, in the refugee legislation, in the migration law. And we've been with a lot of partners denouncing it, but so far nothing happened, and it's still there. It's more than a year and a half of restrictions to the border, and more than a year and a half of people not having the right to apply for the refugee status. And this is a huge problem. On indigenous people's rights and environmental, social environmental rights, it's really, really important to raise the weakening of environmental protections, dismantling monitoring bodies such as IBAMA, FUNAI, or ICMBio here in Brazil. And since Bolsonaro government has also systematically weakened public environmental inspections body, as I mentioned, and attacking NGOs that are protecting social environmental rights here. So this is, of course, a huge setback in the international social environmental cause. It's aggravating climate change and global warming. And we had a strong reaction coming from European countries, some European countries. And we also saw initiatives coming from some European countries to stop the negotiations of the European Union and Mercosur Economic Trade Agreement. So it's interesting and important to have this attention, and any new move to advance in the negotiations of this agreement, it's really, really important that negotiators, especially from Europe, will prioritize real commitments and real concrete results from the Brazilian government in terms of indigenous protection or social environmental rights. Otherwise, this is only empty promises. As we saw President Bolsonaro saying empty promises in the climate summit organized by President Biden. Again, empty promises at the GA, the General Assembly session. And in the end of the year, we have the COP in Scotland, and again we are expecting more and more empty promises coming from Brazil in terms of real commitments to protect social environmental rights. And my very last topic is civil society and social participation, because all of these human rights violations and this huge amount of attacks to constitutional guarantees, they are facing challenges. So we are now, I was going to say celebrating, but we are not celebrating at all. We have this mark of 1,000 days of Bolsonaro administration, and there's nothing to celebrate. But if we look back to these 1,000 days of his administration, this administration lost a lot of battles, because this administration is facing opposition, is facing resistance from civil society, from the press, from different, even political position. So to stop these systematic attacks against human rights, it's really important to have a vibrant and free civil society. So I would end my intervention here, calling your attention to it's not enough to talk about only, different human rights violations if we are not also talking about what's in the background of all of this. That's the freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of civil society to fight against all these attacks and to defend the constitutional rights and to defend democracy here. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's amazing to have someone from Conectas here, and it's a very important work you've been doing nowadays in this very big crisis that touches different levels, as you said, and it's good to hear about immigration again, and the way you labeled the empty promises of our government. This is happening again today and again tomorrow. It feels like, every day we have such difficult news coming from our government, and I feel that you brought out those strong words, and it's good to have someone from this NGO side as well when working with the grassroots movements here in Brazil and also in the world. As I said, you're also working in a big picture. So welcome. Oh, thank you again for coming today. So let's move to our final presentation with Professor John Wouters. You have 20 minutes, Professor, and thank you again for coming and talking to us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be in this panel, and I was very happy with the presentations of my distinguished colleagues. I'm going to talk from a little, say, somewhat different perspective. I will not dare to engage in a comparison between Latin American countries and the European Union. I would love to do that, but since I'm a European and I am, let's say, better at ease in European policies, I will first say a few words with regard to the European Union and human rights. But I would like to link a European dimension and a European approach to an international approach. And in that sense, what I would like to do is to link some of the issues and challenges that we are having in Europe with regard to human rights to what is now on the international agenda of the United Nations. And when I say the agenda of the United Nations, I'm referring in particular to a very recent report by the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres. And on the 10th of September, earlier this month, Mr. Guterres presented a very interesting report called Our Common Agenda. And that common agenda basically is his agenda for renewing the UN, making it a more relevant organization for the 21st century. And there are lots of interesting issues relating to human rights in this report of the UN Secretary General. So I'm going to try to connect European and international approaches and maybe compare a little bit where it can be useful. Now, on the European Union and human rights, I hope you will not mind me making a little bit publicity for two recent books that we published with Oxford University Press. I'm sorry to do this. The one is the European Union and Human Rights. It's an edited volume. The other one is a case text and materials book on the EU and human rights. So I stop with making some self-promotion now, but I just want to say the EU has a deep commitment to human rights. We all know that. And they continue repeating that in every possible forum, including in the General Assembly, say, general debate, as we have seen last week. But there are many, many challenges for the European Union in this respect, both internal challenges and external challenges. What do I mean with internal challenges? Well, in Europe, we also have a problem of, let's say, the backsliding in the respect for some of the fundamental values on which the European Union is built. The fundamental values of the EU, you know, I am a lawyer, and in that sense, I always like to refer to the treaty texts, right? I have some colleagues who are political scientists who say, well, you should never even look at treaties. It's not relevant. You know, it's too formalistic. I don't agree with that in the following sense, that the European Union is very much a construction of law and of a legal order, and that has been part of its success story also, that it has been able to, let's say, update and develop and deepen its, treaties and its institutional structures. And in the current European Union Treaty, you have this very interesting Article 2 of the EU Treaty, which sums up the fundamental values which, on which the European Union is based, and which it says are common to the member states of the European Union. Because in order to become a member of the European Union, every member state had to basically commit to the respect of those fundamental values, and not just to the respect of those values, it also had to commit to promoting those fundamental values. That's something which you find in Article 49 of the EU Treaty. Why am I saying this? Because here we face a problem. You know, the European Union currently counts 27 member states. We unfortunately lost a very important member state, the United Kingdom, last year. But the 27 member states of the EU currently are also very diverse countries. And you know that they have become part of the EU in various enlargement waves. And what we have seen is that, yeah, countries were, of course, very keen on joining the European Union and enjoying all the benefits of the European integration process. But once they are in and they have their established rights within the institutions, that they have their guaranteed financial streams and subsidies and so on, and they can exercise veto rights within the Council of Ministers, then it has become much more difficult to keep those countries to the respect of those fundamental values. And currently we are seeing a number of very worrying tendencies. The names are known, I'm not telling any secret. We have a problem of what we call the rule of law backsliding in countries such as Hungary and Poland. But I should not just single out those countries. That would be too easy. There are problems of democratic and rule of law backsliding in quite a number of other European countries. Populism is on the rise. Extreme right approaches are on the rise. Nationalism is back on the rise. And we also see more generally a bit of a crisis of trust between citizens and the European institutions. Now, a couple of words in this respect. First of all, the EU is committed to upholding its fundamental values, but internally speaking, the big question is how can the European institutions make sure that member states, which continue to be sovereign countries, you know, that member states continue to live up to those fundamental values that they signed up for. It's really not easy. It's really not easy. There are a number of instruments available to the European Union in the treaties. There is a so-called nuclear device procedure, which provides for the possibility to suspend certain membership rights of countries that violate the fundamental values of the EU. But the big problem is that you need unanimity in the European Council to activate that mechanism. And I mentioned to you already two countries, Poland and Hungary, who are in a kind of, say, downwards cycle with regard to respect for the rule of law. You can imagine that those two countries are also protecting each other within the European Council, so that it's impossible to reach unanimity, even minus one country against whom you would like to take certain measures. So that nuclear procedure is actually not going anywhere. We have the European Commission that is able to bring and has brought quite a number of cases against those countries before the European Court of Justice. Very important mechanism. I think the Commission should even use it more systematically, especially also vis-a-vis what I would call systemic violations and threats to those fundamental values of Article 2 of the EU Treaty. But there are limits to what the Commission can do, and there are limits to what I would call the judicial approach, because a court of justice can, of course, come up with a very strong judgment, but it's always after the facts. It's always after the violations have taken place, and sometimes the realities on the ground have changed forever and are almost irreversible. So in that sense, we really also need stronger preventative mechanisms to make sure governments continue to stick to those fundamental values. This is just one of the internal challenges. I cannot give you a complete picture of that. I would like to make reference to a large research project we are conducting, and that is called the Reconnect project. You can find it on our website in Leuven. The Reconnect project is a European funded project about democracy and rule of law and how to reconnect Europe to its citizens. And that's where we have done a lot of research on the problems that I've just described and tried to come up with some valuable policy recommendations. Now about the external challenge. The external challenge is, of course, that the European Union has put in its own treaties that it wants to really promote the universality and indivisibility of human rights. Those of you who have a human rights expertise, you will know that's indeed the language used in Article 21 of the EU Treaty, but it's actually copy-paste from a very important United Nations document, and that is the Vienna Declaration of 1993. The Vienna Declaration, the World Human Rights Summit in Vienna, also agreed on a text in which there is emphasis on the universality, the indivisibility, and the interdependence and interrelatedness of all human rights. So officially, the European Union wants to promote in its external policies that universality and indivisibility of human rights. But as you know, the EU also faces challenges there. A challenge, first of all, of being consistent with itself, going for human rights and not, say, prioritize trade interests or energy security interests, or just security interests as such in a time of counterterrorism and a time of, say, increased violence at the borders of Europe. There is a strong tendency for the EU to protect itself and its citizens, become a little bit of a fortress. Think also about the problems with regard to migration. And so indeed, it is not always easy for the EU to be consistent with its own commitment to the promotion, the universal promotion of human rights. There was mention in one of the previous presentations to the EU-Mercosur agreement. I hope the agreement comes about, but indeed one of the big challenges is how far can the EU go in its trade policy, in its trade agreements, or in its investment agreements. There is another recent case, the investment agreement with China. How far can the EU go to promote and even try to strengthen the commitment to human rights by another country through its trade agreements? It's a difficult exercise. I cannot elaborate on that more. Maybe we can do that during the discussion. But I want to come back now, if I may, Samara, I want to come back to the United Nations dimension, because there we have now this great, really, really very worth reading report, our common agenda of the Secretary General. And you know what is so interesting? If you read the part on human rights, the issues that he describes are actually very, let's say, similar to what we see as challenges within the European Union. He starts by saying there is currently, especially in the post-COVID era, a deep crisis of trust. People don't believe their governments anymore. There is a kind of disconnect between citizens and governments. And there is also, let's say, a much frayed social, say, fabric. And we need new forms of solidarity. In fact, the Secretary General is calling for a new social contract. So that's very interesting to see how he wants to do that. There are lots of very, very beautiful recommendations in his report, and I cannot be exhaustive here. I just want to point to a couple of things and then link it to the European debate. First of all, the Secretary General, in terms of rebuilding trust within national societies, is really inviting national governments to conduct what he calls national listening and envisioning the future exercises. And he says, yeah, you can do that digitally in order to be very inclusive and so on. I think that's an excellent idea. And I would like to point to something of a very interesting experiment that in this particular respect, we are currently doing within Europe. You may not have yet heard about it. In Europe, we currently have what we call the Conference on the Future of Europe. It's a new initiative that is meant to really involve very broadly citizens of all over Europe and all stakeholders, I mean, basically players in society, including, of course, civil society, to ask, well, what can we do better? How can Europe become better, more efficient, more fair, more social, and so on and so forth? And that's very interesting. I myself, last Saturday, participated virtually in an exercise, what we call a citizens panel, which was a session of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. So you had the hemicycle of the European Parliament, 200 citizens from all over Europe were there, and they were very openly discussing issues such as democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and so on. And I must say those citizens panels are something quite interesting because it really gives those citizens a direct possibility of brainstorming, of discussing what they consider very important issue. And so I think there indeed, this idea of having national listening exercises, well, we could maybe take a look at what is currently being done in Europe to organize indeed a kind of, I would say, advanced debate between our citizens. You must, of course, when you want to build back trust and when you want to renew a social contract, there are all kinds of things you have to do. I was very happy to read in the Secretary General's report that he wants to promote a new vision of the rule of law at the global level. And that's a challenge because, yes, global rule of law at national level is already very often a challenge, but at global level, it's, of course, even more difficult. Now, the good thing is we do have something to build upon because some of you may remember that in 2012, we had a high-level declaration of the General Assembly on the rule of law. And that by itself is a compromise text, of course, but it's a very good starting base to deepen the discussion about the respect for the rule of law. And I think, I mean, it has for a while not been very active, but I really hope that the UN will pick up the thread again of that rule of law report and its implementation. And then, of course, there's the whole challenge which the Secretary General refers to of inclusion, becoming inclusive, trying to improve social protection systems, education, gender equality, and so on and so forth. What the Secretary General, and then I'm going to stop and hopefully we can have debates because I see a lot of questions popping up. There is another thing that the Secretary General is basically noting in his report. He says, you know, we are going towards the important year 2023. Why is 2023 an important year for human rights? It's the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will turn 75. As you know, the Universal Declaration is from December 1948. So in 2023, we will have an important anniversary for human rights. We also will have the 30th anniversary of the Vienna Convention that I already mentioned, the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights, the result of the Vienna Summit in 1993. So that's going to be, I think, an interesting deadline by which the Secretary General invites us to have discussions about human rights and especially, let's say, visions on human rights for the future, including, of course, you know, new challenges such as universal access to the internet as a human right, but also, you know, reconsidering, updating human rights, looking at all kinds of new challenges. Think about online or social media violence or hatred. Think about cybersecurity issues, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there are plenty of issues and challenges for the human rights scene and the human rights instruments also of the United Nations. And I think there, indeed, the Secretary General is calling for a big discussion. And I hope, and there I will end up with, that indeed also in the EU-Latin America relationship, we can seize that opportunity to deepen the discussion about human rights within our societies, but I hope also between our societies, and that when it comes to reforming and coming up with innovations on human rights within the United Nations, I sincerely hope that the Latin American people and the European people may be on the same page and make a common front in order to, let's say, deepen a values-based commitment of the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John, for your talk. I think you touched different, very important points of the global agenda on human rights right now. And I like to see maybe in the Q&A, in the discussion, more on this building of trust. I think it's a very important topic, and how we could improve this trust between Europe and Latin America and so on. But let's move to the Q&A. As I said, we have lots of questions coming, and I think we can divide into two different moments, because we have separate questions for Patrícia and Camila, and I'll start with those individual questions, then I can move to the group questions. So first one for Camila, what would be the main strategies to improve the agenda for migration in the sphere of the relationships between EU and Mercosur?
Wow.
Do you want me to read again in Portuguese?
No.
Yeah, that was
no, I have it. I was just thinking how much sincere I want to be. Because I think when we discuss migration agenda, it's really difficult to look at Europe as an example. And unfortunately, especially in academia, we always look at Europe as the source of great ideas for human rights. And as the global South, we are the source of problems for human rights. But in migration, I think this is the opposite. I mean, in many other agenda, but in migration, I sincerely hope that our government will not learn and bring these horrible measures and horrible policies to Brazil. So one thing to Regiane that asked this question is Brazil and the Latin American countries that do have positive migration policies should be vocal at the international space and should be vocal in, for instance, we have the EU and Brazil human rights dialogue. Migration is something that we have as a Brazilian state much more good practice to share instead of, learning and bringing experience from Europe. But this is only based on the legislation we have, because in practice, unfortunately, the current government is changing the implementation of these positive legislations. So everything we are seeing can be on family reunification, can be on granting refugee status, can be on deportation, can be on closing borders. All these decrees and norms are in opposition to what's established in our legislation. So in one hand, of course, Brazil, we are in a better position in terms of human rights and migrant protection compared to many European countries, but I don't see much authority and credibility for this current government federal government to show them, because actually what we are seeing since the beginning of this administration, Bolsonaro administration, is finding ways, can be on resolutions in CONADI, our National Committee for Refugees, can be on decrees by the Minister of Justice to undermine the legislation. But I think civil society should always exchange more, and a main strategy can be more exchange among civil society groups. But yeah, that's it. And sorry, in the beginning I was just thinking, because usually we always think about how we can learn from Europe, and this is a really good example that, well, sometimes it's not the only way.
Sure, definitely. So next one for Patrícia, also by Regiane Pereira. How does the theme refuge could be better treated, approached by, included in the sphere of the EU and Mercosur relationships?
First, I'd like to say that I agree completely with Camila, and also in asylum topics to have this situation. I would say that there is a tax to the implementation of our legal framework considering asylum and migration, especially after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And of course, this government has really exacerbated this movement and these problems with the implementation that we have been seeing, especially since the middle of 2016. And asylum is another topic that is complicated, as so morally what European Union is doing about asylum is doing the externalization of asylum, so paying to other countries to deal with possible refugees or asylum seekers. So we've been seeing the rise in funding for Frontex and other technologies of border control, including the use of biometrics, the agreements with Libya, the agreements with Turkey. So in the European Union, Mercosur relationships, I would say asylum would be treated in the same way. So maybe funding Brazil to treat better refugees or possible refugees, to avoid Venezuelans to go to Europe, because we have to think that last year Venezuelans were the third group that applied more to asylum in the European Union, especially in Spain. So to use this strategy to keep those Latin Americans in Latin America, and then maybe fund initiatives to keep those people in Latin America, and try to fund other programs, and also through partnerships between training or courses or things like that. So I think that maybe the European Union could push human rights topics in the discussions with Mercosur in other areas, but in asylum and migration, as Camila commented, is a very difficult topic, because the European countries, they have been treating this topic as an externalization now. So we are going to pay you to deal with that because we don't want to deal with that. So yes.
Okay, thanks. So I'll move for the second round, and I'll bring 3 questions, and it's for everyone. You can decide which one each one you can pick. First one, how could EU-LAC relations could help both regions on dealing with such problems that were presented, especially on migration? So actually this one maybe for Patrícia. How may the EU-Mercosur agreement concretely affect human rights issues in Mercosur, especially in Brazil? Can the agreement really push countries to respect HR legislations? And how do the panelists see the impact of the rise of right and extreme right-wing governments in LAC and Europe in issues such as human rights, democracy, and immigration? I think, Patrícia, do you want to bring more comments on the issue of migration?
Yes, I think I want to say 1 or 2 things about the rise of right and extreme right wings. So I would say that right and extreme right wings, they love migrants, because you can just blame migrants for everything. And you have a very powerful discourse, and we are seeing discourse rising not only in Europe but also in Latin America, and blaming migrants and refugees for all problems that are actually bad policy decisions. And at the same time, in Europe, in the United Kingdom now, since Brexit, we also see how this discourse can be misleading. So now we are seeing the shortage of a lot of products in the United Kingdom, the chaos with the for people to put gas in the gas stations, and the lack of gas, not because of a shortage, but because of distribution and the lack of migrants in the United Kingdom, and how some groups, some right-wing groups, they are blaming COVID and not Brexit and all the bad political decisions because of that. So the rise of right governments and extreme right-wing governments, I think in a sense makes those topics easier to discuss, because both the right and extreme right governments in Latin America, they are really against migrants, and also in Europe they tend to blame migrants for a lot of things. So in that case, again, that's another of the reasons why I don't see a lot of possibilities of the EU Latin American dialogues actually developing or guaranteeing more protection of migrants and refugees' rights, also because of this movement of the rise of right-wing governments in both regions that use migrants as the big threats to everything. And yes, that's the comments that I want to do, I think.
Samara, can I touch on the Mercosur and EU agreement?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Because I think sometimes we think that, okay, once the agreement is signed and is in force, what can be done? But actually, I believe now, considering the situation we are living in now, it's a good timing that the agreement is still under negotiation, because now it's the time to establish the limits and to establish the minimum, and to use these negotiations as a way to show that there are some, red lines, and from here, Brazil and any other state will actually have problems instead of benefits in terms of trade and economy. So I believe now it's the moment, and especially for civil society, we need to show and to provide inputs for European negotiators of what's happening here. Because of course, President Bolsonaro is occupying the UN stage, or will go to the COP in Scotland and will promise a lot of things. But and it's again, the world knows what's happening. We are all watching the fires, and we are all watching the deforestation rates growing in Brazil. But what perhaps it's necessary to give further information is about the attempts from this administration to undermine the legislation. Again, I can do a comparison to what's happening in the migration field. So we do have a good legislation in Brazil, and this good legislation is the one responsible to refrain some destructions in terms of migrant protection, environmental protections, and so on and so forth. But so and in the two first years of this administration, Bolsonaro tried to find other ways to undermine this legislation by adopting decrees, by dismantling monitoring bodies. But in 2021, and it's relevant for international audience to know that situation changed in the parliament. So now the Bolsonaro has a strong supporters to push and adopt changes in legislation. So I think one good important thing for this Mercosur and EU trade agreement negotiation is to inform European negotiators about the attempts by Bolsonaro to change the environmental license law we have here. President Bolsonaro is always also trying to change legislation allowing economic activities in indigenous lands, such as mining. We also have the federal government trying to change by a new law. So there's a bill advancing in the House of Commons in Brazil, trying to establish a new thesis, legal thesis, on the time frame for indigenous land demarcation, saying that, okay, only indigenous living in the land when the Constitution was adopted has the right to that land. So this is unconstitutional, but they're trying to change it in the Congress. So I believe showing and using this momentum of negotiating the trade, it's important to raise awareness of these attempts to change legislation, because some of the guarantees that even European negotiators are using that, okay, but it's fine because we have a legislation protecting environmental licensing. But this can be passed if Bolsonaro succeeds in changing some of these norms.
Yeah, we hope he doesn't. But very well put. Thank you, Camila. I think we can bring more two questions that are connected. They are also to everyone, and I think I'd like to listen to Jan on this one. Would it be possible to harmonize core regional legislation on human rights in LAC and Europe? And how can the EU strengthen instruments to enforce the rule of law commitment in its member states?
Thank you. Let me start with that last question, because I touched briefly upon it. I mentioned that there are some mechanisms provided for in the European treaties. I mentioned this nuclear device, Article 7. I mentioned the Commission's power to sue the member states before the European Court of Justice, what we call infringement cases. There is also the possibility under the treaties for the member states themselves to sue each other before the European Court of Justice. It's very interesting, but they don't usually like to do that. So, I mean, member states like to hide a little bit behind the back of the European Commission, so it sues the other bad guys rather than they themselves go up and really bring a case. But it's not excluded that at some stage it may happen. The Dutch parliament, for instance, in the beginning of this year, adopted a resolution urging its government to bring such, a Dutch case against notably Poland with regard to the rule of law. But the Dutch government didn't really follow up on that. There is a very interesting new development here. You may have heard about that. Last year in December, the EU adopted a new legislation, what we call a conditionality regulation. What is this? It is for the first time a tool that allows the European Commission to basically suspend, say, money going to member states from the EU budget when there are really serious rule of law problems within that country. That can have to do with corruption, but it can also have to do with systemic backsliding with regard to human rights. You can imagine that countries like Poland and Hungary were not very keen on agreeing on that regulation. In one or the other way, they gave in. There were a couple of political compromises made, but the very fact of the matter is this is a new law on the block, and there are many parties, including the European Parliament, that are urging the European Commission to really use this new conditionality regulation. Apart from that, there are still many what I call softer approaches, which include annual reports by the Commission on the state of the rule of law in the member states. It's a very useful tool, but it should become, I think, more critical, and it should really also highlight when certain issues become systemic in nature, so that you don't have the impression that, yeah, all member states are sinners. They're all having shortcomings with regard to the rule of law. I think it's important to realize that some are more sinners than the other, especially when it comes to systemic attacks upon the foundations of the rule of law. So there is this annual report. There is the Justice Scoreboard of the European Commission, quite a number of other things, dialogues within the Council and so on. All these things matter. The main thing is that they are being effectively used and that the institutions have the courage to really push them through, that the member states also support the institutions in this respect. The other question is very interesting as well. The question whether indeed you could envisage a form of harmonization of core regional human rights legislation in Europe and Latin America. Now, that's a very ambitious question, and I'm not going to be able to give you an on-the-spot comprehensive answer. First of all, I have to point to an issue in Europe, and that is the following strange thing. You may not realize this, because now there is so much, say, language on human rights in the EU treaties. We owe that to the Treaty of Lisbon, which 12 years ago entered into force. And you have now really lots of references to human rights and the commitment of the EU to human rights in the EU treaties. But the strange thing is that as a regional organization, the EU has not really received competences, legal powers to adopt, say, human rights-based legislation. There are existing powers of the EU, for instance, with regard to adopting non-discrimination legislation that could be used to advance the cause of human rights. And there are currently indeed voices that are urging the Commission to use that more, let's say, systematically. But I really should caution you, the EU as an organization does not have a general human rights legislative power. It can only deal with human rights in the internal legislation on the basis of existing legal competences. For instance, you can think the GDPR, the well-known General Data Protection Regulation, is something that the EU adopted and which has to do also with protecting people and especially the human right to privacy, if you see what I mean. But so a general human rights legislation at EU level is actually not really possible. And in that sense, harmonizing European regional human rights legislation with what happens in Latin America may be a little bit theoretical as a perspective, but I like it as an idea. And I think it's maybe something that we, as scholars, we should try to work on and exchange experiences. By that, I'm saying the following thing. What is so fascinating about human rights in our two respective areas is that in both areas, human rights is a multi-level type of system. You have the national, I guess also in Brazil, in federal states, you have state legislation, you have the national or federal level. You do have a regional level in Europe that is not just the EU, but also the Council of Europe with the European Convention and the European Court of Human Rights. But you have that in Latin America as well with the, the American human rights system. And I think that that's extremely interesting. And I really think that there are lots of very fascinating interactions between, say, your local, your national, your regional, and the American human rights protection system, the global system, the UN system, to which you are also part, just like the Europeans, and how these interact with each other. You know that at the global level, a number of instruments have actually just been elaborated after regional initiatives on human rights were taken in Latin America. You know, for instance, this is the case with the United Nations Convention of 2006 regarding the enforced disappearances. Why did the UN develop such an instrument? Basically because Latin America showed the way. And in that sense, I really think that it could be very inspirational to see bottom-up, if you wish, dynamics to push for new human rights standards, especially in new areas where we need new standards.
Thank you. Thank you for inspiring comments, Professor John. And we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I would like to pass the word for Patrícia and Camila and Professor Jan, again, following the order of the presentation. And Patrícia, if you want to bring more comments on these last two questions, you can bring, and Camila as well, of course. or you can just move to express your final closing words for this panel, please.
I just have to make a brief comment that we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we're still not sure on how things will proceed after the pandemic, or the so-called new normal. We still have a lot of inequality in access to vaccines, for example, and access to health. And that could be another area, if we are talking about human rights, the right to health, that we should be discussing as well between Europe and Latin America. So we still are facing this situation, so we still need to see how this will impact the work of advocacy, civil society organizations, and also the negotiations between Europe and Latin America. So I think that's just one point I would like to add. And yes, that was just it. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to discuss. You have my email, you have my Twitter if you'd like to engage more in other discussions. Thank you so much.
I also just want to thank again for the invitation to have the chance to be here in this debate. It was a pleasure to share this moment with Samara, Patrícia, and Professor Wouters. I think just reinforce the topic about civil society, because I believe the world knows what's happening in Brazil in terms of social environmental violations. The world knows the problems of the response to the pandemic here, which was also we were also a place where we had a new variant of the virus because of this disastrous, terrible response to the pandemic. I believe also the world knows now that our president is threatening to not respect the results of the elections. There was an interesting press coverage of these anti-democratic demonstrations in September 7th. But I don't think the world really knows that civil society is under attack in Brazil. So I would just close with these warning words, saying that, and also saying that there's a lot of human rights being attacked in different areas: migration, women's rights, children's rights, the fight against racism. But there's resistance here, and actually the Bolsonaro administration was defeated many times. But this is just because we have free press, because we have institutions, democratic institutions that are still surviving, but also because we have a free and vibrant civil society. So yeah, I think that's my final remark.
Thank you. Professor John, any final remarks?
Well, I think I've spoken long enough, and my thinking in the meantime. So I would like to really thank you and congratulate the organizers with this excellent initiative. And I would really like to stress that here in Leuven, we are extremely open to continuing and deepening the dialogue between Latin America and Europe. I think in this turbulent world, we really need each other to support each other, to learn from each other, and to really foster the cause of human rights, not just in our societies, but also at the global stage within the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John. Just like to say, it was a pleasure to share this panel today on human rights. And I'd like to thank you again, Camila, Patrícia, and John, for your interest to participate in our panel today. And it was a pleasure to meet you and share this moment with you. And as Camila said, there is resistance, and let's stay strong and connected. And that's it. Thank you, and hope to see you again. And maybe in person at some point. Take care. And thank you
Bye-bye.
everyone who
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Take
All the best.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.